Hello everyone and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Jose.
I'm Mike.
And today is for me a special day because I've been obsessed with this film called 120 Beats Per Minute. This is the second podcast that I've done on it, though the first for Eavesdropping at the Movies. And I was very, very keen to hear what Mike, who is much younger than I and who is not gay, felt about a film that myself, as a middle-aged gay man, felt, particularly identified and moved by. So, what did you think, Mike?
Well, I liked it. That's a fair enough way to start. I think well, let's just briefly say, I suppose, what it's about.
Yes. Well, it's a film about the active movement in Paris. And it basically starts off, the whole first hour of the film is just about meetings and procedures and, the actions and the necessity of taking actions and, kind of the outrage that, the government is doing nothing and all these people are dying and, these very young men of various kinds all really taking political action to save their lives, right?
Yeah, and a romantic story develops. So there are slight romantic stories. They're not really it's not saying they're not focused, but it's not heavily plot driven around them.
Yes, I mean, so the whole first hour of the film is really, and I think it's incredible cinema because it really is all about meetings and procedures. And during these meetings, these two characters, Sean and Nathan, meet. They fall in love. One is HIV positive, the other one isn't. And actually, they fall in love, they plan to move in together, and as the guy moves in together, he barely is in long enough for him to die, basically.
Yeah.
That's the story in a nutshell, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a spoiler in there in that the character dies, but then this was a period of time. This is a period of time which everyone, people died sort of en masse. We were talking about it. I watched the film last night, so we saw Avengers yesterday, and then after we were talking about, I've really got to see 120 beats per minute because it just is an antidote to Avengers, and because it's so important to you.
Yes, I've been forcing people to watch it, so you're, it's not just you. So
yeah,
I got Adam Carver, who's like your age but gay, to see it and talk it over with me. I wanted to see what his perspective would be. I got my sister, my brother-in-law. I forced them to see it with me. They were in London. They could have gone to see the Rodin or something, but no, I forced them into a cinema in the middle of a sunny spring afternoon because I felt they had to understand.
Yeah. So what we were also talking about yesterday was, I just kind of asked you, this is set in the early 90s in France. And this is an era and a place and a period of time where people with AIDS were dying left, right and centre. There was no help really, and ACT UP in the film is fighting a pharmaceutical company that is basically refusing to release test results that would help gay people and people with HIV and AIDS.
They're acting on different fronts. So they're protesting against the government. They're putting education as to safe sex in the schools.
Yes.
And also they are lobbying the pharmaceutical companies and protesting against the pharmaceutical companies. So it's actions that actually take place on different fronts.
Yeah.
That we see.
And you showed me photos of old friends of yours, and you said this is a person who died.
Yes.
And I said to you, did you lose many people back then? Which I never really asked you before.
No, it's very much the story of my life, really, and very much the story, I think, of my generation, certainly in Montreal, because, so I was watching this play called The Inheritance.
Right.
In London, which is kind of in a way similar. It's an intergenerational gay thing, and the AIDS years are very prominent in it. And there's a character in it who's Walter, who dies in the course of the play, who's meant to be the old generation, who lived through all of this. And I was very fascinated by one line because it said, Walter came to New York and fell in love with Henry. He was 19 and it was in 1981. Well, I was 19 in 1981, so I'm that old guy, right? Who from that previous generation. But really, kind of, it was a really homophobic time anyway. right? It was kind of very difficult to come out, and all our first kind of demonstrations and so on were about like police brutality just in clubs and things like that. So, you know, I don't think I really became aware, you know, about the AIDS virus until maybe 83 or something like that, right? But, you know, I was an undergraduate in 1983. I graduated in 1985. So, all of these, I mean, we were the first generation who was hit by it that didn't know about it, right? So there was a period where you didn't know about it, you know, and then it became like the most scary thing in your life, really. You know, and I was telling you that out of the people, you know, for a very, very long time, I assumed that most of the people who were in the gay sock with me at McGill in the years that I was a student had died. You know, like 80% of them. I subsequently found out that that wasn't true because, you know, you go on Facebook and you reconnect with people. And, you know, it wasn't as many as I thought. But still, there was a lot, right? And
well, you showed me the passage. I asked you this, and you showed me this passage. It's from the end of Act 1 of The Inheritance, where it's basically the conversation we were having. One character asks another, "What was it really like?" And there's just this list. He just recites this list. Daniel's dead. Ian's dead. Chris is dead. Simon's ill, and just this list goes on and on and on and on of all the people, and it's. I was just reading it. I wasn't watching it being performed. It was heartbreaking just to read it.
Yes.
You know, and get that impression.
I think it's the thing that kind of most shaped my life. You know, and actually during this whole period, I was kind of very happily ensconced in a relationship. I was very much in love, and you know, I lived through all of this. With a partner, which is I think what saved me really, you know, but kind of, you know, there are photos of parties that we had in the mid 80s, you know, and there are people who, you know, who are 20 and died 3 years later, and kind of, you know, so many of those people. You have to ask other friends for their names because you can't even remember. Right. Yeah. So, so for me, it is the thing that most shaped my life, really. So you know, kind of, you lost a whole bunch of people. I mean, at a certain point, I was arguing foolishly because I was saying there's no other generation, you know, that in a way has suffered like what we suffered. You know, and then you think, of course, it's ridiculous. I mean, you think of the Holocaust, and you know, but it had that feeling of plague, of, you know, like the discrimination was so brutal, you know, and it was such a horrible way of dying, like, you know, because kind of basically people's autoimmune deficiencies would like collapse, right, and then they would just be victims to whatever, you know, disease happened. You know, but people would really suffer, and you know, and their faces would become distorted, and their bodies would become distorted, and you know, it was a really gruesome way of dying, really. So without anyone wanting to take care of them. I mean, as you saw in the play, like in the U.S., you even had to declare whether somebody had died of AIDS in your flat. There was that level of discrimination. Yeah, before renting it out to other people. So, you know, so it's something. It's material that I am very vulnerable to. I weep at the thought of it, really. So, you know, which is also why kind of I want to talk about it with so many people, right? Yeah. You know, is the movie really great, or is it just something that I am particularly attuned to?
Well, would you be surprised to hear that I didn't cry?
I would be surprised to hear that.
Okay, well then be surprised.
Maybe not a surprise. I mean, you know, I do know that you are somebody who cries at Toy Story 3, but the greater tragedies of life pass you by.
It's true. So, you know, it's maybe not the film's failing. I think the film is very effective, but I think it is definitely. I can see exactly why you feel that this film was made precisely for you. Yes. You know, this film is about, maybe you weren't in Paris, but this film is about your life back then.
It's my generation.
It's your generation and your sort of milieu, and like, so for instance, the film kind of has a specificity, but actually out of that specificity comes the sort of generality of experience. So, for instance, the activists in Act Up in the film, the first thing you see them do, or one of the first things you see them do, is invade the offices of the pharmaceutical company and throw blood bags, fake blood,
yes.
And posters saying assassin killer.
Yes.
This kind of not exactly violent but visceral political and social protest against them. Now, most gay people, maybe most gay people, I don't know, back then didn't do something like that, but they will have known people who did. It was in the kind of water, or they've done something similar. So that I think kind of really would speak to you.
Yes, I mean, let's not overestimate it. I mean, one of the things that has just been progress is, that the people who were gay activists then, and who did go on marches and who did organize things and whatever, were a tiny, tiny, tiny minority compared to the people who are out now or who are married now, right? Like, it took a certain kind of either guts or just being shunned, by your family and your community to be out in those ways and to actually be an activist in those ways. There was a very small percentage of people who were homosexual who actually kind of were activists in those ways. And it's interesting in the film because, of course, most of the people who are being activists in those ways in this film are people who are infected by the virus, right?
Yeah.
So, and actually you see there's a really lovely scene, where they're putting up posters and so on, and other gay men who are cruising nearby say, well, why do you have to do this? Why do you always have to scare people, right? Like, yeah. So
it's a film in which observations like that kind of fill in gaps. Like, actually, sort of plot-wise, it's fairly light. It's about a movement and an era.
Yes.
And you kind of like I said, the film is 2.5 hours long, and I think that allows it a lot of time to sink into its world. So you spend a lot of time in these meetings, as you say, particularly in the first hour, and there's a lot of process. And I mean, they talk about clicking the fingers instead of applauding, because that means that you're not distracting people. And in here is debate, and outside is conversation, this sort of thing. Yes. And actually, then when a debate later on in the film, ends up in the hall, they say no, bring it back in here. So there's it almost felt slightly satirical in that. But I think which I don't think is entirely negative. I think it's more of a light-hearted sort of comment on the way that highly organised or highly efficient sort of organisations will practice. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, they were highly efficient, and B, I think there's still a model of how meetings should be run.
Yeah.
Because the point about the clicking of the snapping of the fingers was so that you don't drown out the speaker. You show appreciation, but the speaker can still be heard.
Yes, exactly.
Which makes complete sense, right? The thing about not having backroom conversations is because those backroom conversations then subvert the democratic agreement in the hall, right? Like, so, everything has its reason, right? And that's why those actions were so successful. They were so well carried out. They were so efficient.
Yeah, it really is. And actually, when debate in the chamber... chamber is maybe a bit grand, it's like a lecture hall. When debate in the lecture hall devolves at some points into argument and people start talking up over one another, you still feel that it's kind of a model of how these meetings should be run.
Yes.
Like, they are still civil.
Yes.
And they are still, even when people have problems with each other. There's one point where it's the character is a mother of someone who died of AIDS, I think.
No, it's the mother of a haemophiliac who's sitting next to her, the young boy, the young curly-haired boy, who actually makes the blood balls. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
He's a haemophiliac. He was infected, accidentally, right? And that's his mother.
And she has a problem with something that's been printed about her. I can't remember what exactly.
She wants to sue and send someone to jail because of an unjust comment that they've made. Right. And so the whole argument is we're not here to put people in jail. We're here to find a solution to people's illness.
Yes, that's right. And I think what she has a problem with amongst the group is that she's been kind of denounced by other members of the group in print.
That's right.
And so she brings it up with them. But even so, there's this fundamental argument taking place about what's the nature of our organisation,
yes,
and how could you, sort of, why have you denounced me in public without speaking to me first?
Yes.
It's still sort of fairly civil. It's not, I think there is something actually really admirable about the way that these debates take place, the meetings take place. I think so too. And I really, really like that.
Yeah, and they were all about like points of principle, right, rather than about kind of personal accusations and so on.
Yeah.
Though what I love about the film is that the personal element is threaded throughout as well.
Yes.
Right. So you see how one person is loved by another, or desires another, or is rejected by another through all of these little glances in the middle of the meeting. Right? That then affect kind of other things as the film unfolds.
Yeah, so the film really starts off with these meetings, and the personal stories become woven into it more and more, and so you go back to Sean's flat, he goes back to his flat with Nathan, so you come back to them together, and then they're in bed, and it's a film that is, we've spoken quite a lot about the Peach thing, and Call Me By Your Name, and how puritanical it is about actual physical acts of gay sex. And this film is not. I mean, it's not hardcore, but it's not afraid to show bodies on bodies, and even a man thrusting behind another man in that sort of flashback moment where Sean's talking about the first time he had sex, and that was when he got infected. Is what he's talking about.
Yes, with his teacher.
And it's actually really physical because it's beautifully done. Actually, he's in bed with Nathan at the time. And as he tells this story, the camera pans down to the bed, and then this other character from the flashback, this teacher character, shows up sort of in the room. So it's not like a cut or like a fade to black or anything. He's right there, and it makes it that much more sort of physical and corporeal.
Yeah, the cutting is beautiful, and actually one of the interesting things that I found about this is that Campillo, the director of the film, basically he's a writer, but he actually makes a lot of his living just editing other people's films, and he's one of the few people who really kind of largely makes a living as an editor, who has then made these films. So this is very much, director as editor filmmaking, right? And you could see the skill involved in that, because actually I do think that the whole first half hour in, the lecture hall, which is all about meetings and actions and points of principle and so on, is a tour de force of editing.
Yeah. No, it actually is. I mean, I remember watching The Class. I think
he wrote that, and I think he edited that as well.
Did he not direct it?
No.
Just give me one moment.
I'll give you one moment because I'm often wrong, but I think I'm right.
No, you're quite right. He didn't direct The Class. He edited and screenwrote for it. Which was a film I found. The thing about The Class is I remember that I have watched it.
Yes.
I don't remember anything about it.
Yes.
I'm reasonably sure I found it quite dull, to be honest. And I think there are elements of that in this that you could find dull. I think the screen time, I think the running length it's not a problem, because I think it's what is required to really become invested in the world and the era that the film is portraying. But there are times when I felt it was dragging for me. I think that it's incredibly evocative of the time and place.
Yes.
But maybe that lack of identification for me was more of an issue than it was for you. You felt this was about me, is what you felt.
Well, I felt in a certain way that it was definitely not me personally, but about my generation very clearly.
Okay.
And I recognized everything and I identified with much of it. But just trying to be as objective of it as I can, I actually don't think there's an extraneous moment.
Okay.
And I kind of, if you do think, I would be very interested to know which ones you think are.
Well, it's true to say that I wouldn't be able to think of like a moment to cut.
Yes.
That's certainly true. I mean, I don't want to go overboard saying, talking about the duration. Because I don't think there's like a specific moment I could say, well, that felt extraneous. Or I don't think I could say like, well, if only the meeting scenes had been a bit shorter each time. Because everything did feel like it had a place.
Yes, and everything was personalized in a way, so, because, the film, we were talking about like Infinity Wars, well, this has a huge cast of characters as well.
Yeah.
And it weaves them in a way that each is that recognizably distinct, but they're also kind of representative of a movement, and then there's also like a central couple. But if you remember the beginning, and I forget his name, but the young man who comes in and he's a history student, and you know, he's just been diagnosed, and the doctor tells him that he's like kind of becoming ill, losing immunity very quickly, that his T cell counts or whatever, or CD4 counts are dropping very fast, and they don't know why.
Is this the character who faints in the chair?
Faints, right? And then, you know, in moments he's at the hospital, and in moments he's dead, and in moments his picture's kind of being used, you know, in a march, right? And I found it all very moving, right? You know, so you get a sense of who that character is, right? You do get a sense of a person, right? Rather than just a number, right? But on the other hand, that's just like a little tiny strand of the film, right?
Yeah.
You know, and there are kind of many moments like that and many characters like that. I found it deeply, deeply touching, you know.
Yeah.
And there are moments that I found like kind of unique. So I don't know if you follow Dag. I forget his surname.
No.
Anyway, he's a critic, and he was saying on Facebook that he thought, you know, the sex scene in the hospital.
Yes.
That he thought that was the best love scene he's ever seen filmed.
I thought it was pretty extraordinary, I've got to say.
Yes. You know, and I think it's, you know, for me, definitely like the best love scene ever filmed. Because it's truly about love, and it's purely about emotion, right? The guy is ill, he's dying, he says, I'm scared, right? Like, you know, yeah, he's putting his feelings on the line. His body is terrible, he's got Kaposi's, and you can see that it's diseased, right? You know, so like the whole sex scene becomes an act of communication and of compassion and of feeling, and you know, there's this moment where he reaches out in the middle of orgasm to kiss him, you know, to kiss his boyfriend, where you think it's almost like a reaching out for life, you know, like you know, just kind of. So I felt that was so beautiful, really, and so the opposite of what sex scenes do, which is put body on display to get you hot about them, right? This is kind of like the opposite of that. Like the bodies on display are actually unattractive, right? You know, it's all about the feeling.
Well, I think it's a thing about I'm not sure I quite agree with that, because what you're really describing there is porn. Bodies on display to get hard about. When it's purely to display, that's pornographic. And I think that that sex in cinema, usually the problem with it is it doesn't have a strong focus or theme or idea of what it wants to do. And so it can be sort of slightly pornographic, but I mean, obviously it has kind of censorship to worry about as well, or, you know, ratings and whatnot. But very often it feels like this, whatever it's trying to show isn't really coming across. It's often more distracting than anything else. It's like I was listening to Robert Webb, the actor and comedian, was in that film Confetti, where he played a nudist. And although he wasn't having sex in that film, I don't think, but like he talked about how when you're nude on screen, you're competing for attention with your own cock all the time.
Yes.
It's not really the way to act. And I feel like sex scenes very often do that, where they become a distraction just in and of themselves, unless they are so good and have such a sort of project behind them, or idea, or so great in execution. I can only think of, you know, a handful that I've ever felt were really effective for me. I don't know if that, like, for instance, that one in, what was the Cronenberg film, A History of Violence, on the stairs.
Yes.
You know, was a scene that really expressed something, and it moved the story forward, and it spoke about those characters, and it was visceral.
Yes.
And the scene in this is, it's not a sex scene, it's a masturbation scene, which, in 220 beats per minute I'm talking about. Which,
well, but that's sex. That's
sure,
sex.
yeah. Yeah, okay. Well,
I mean, you know.
But yeah, okay, I'm splitting hairs for no reason, I suppose. But again,
Yes,
like,
you are, because, you know, you think of it, the alternative, you know, if you were wanking a woman off, that, you know.
Yeah. yeah. But again, like, it's, I mean, actually, it's like, masturbation is even more of an act of love because it's sort of one-sided.
Yes.
The pleasure.
Yes. But you can see he's reaching out, but he's just incapable.
Yeah.
That's also why it's moving. But let me go back to this idea where you say, you know, sex like that is pornographic, because I don't think so. I think it's a moment of spectacle. So the idea, you know, because you don't have to be explicit. I mean, if you make it explicit, then I suppose it would be pornographic if its only objective is to turn the audience on, you know, and to get the audience off. But I think in commercial filmmaking, you know, kind of the attempt is to get the audience not off, you know, but to get the audience turned on, right, through a moment of spectacle, which actually arrests the narrative in some way. You know, so you always get these, you know, these scenes of glistening bodies, you know, immersed in sheets to hide, you know, kind of all the naughty bits and whatever, you know, and the attention there is really on the glistening bodies and so on, rather than, you know. So actually, I think it is. Yeah. This is very different because this is about communicating emotion rather than to get you to see these beautiful actors.
This is certainly very different, and like I say, I think it is extraordinary, and I was captivated by the scene. I sort of, and you know, yeah. Mind you, you love a glistening body.
I do. You know, but this is an achievement because this is a sex scene where I was just moved.
Yeah. Right,
and you know, I think the representation of sex in this film as a whole, you know, I think is beautiful because it is about, you know, it is about desire, but it is always about the feelings involved around desire, and it's also about, you know, people in places desiring and having sex. Like it's, you know, it's sex is part of life, not as like this ideal kind of moment where, you know, kind of gods writhe.
Well, actually, so Sean dies at the end of the film.
Yes.
He's actually been euthanized by Nathan, hasn't he?
Yes. Well, actually, I wanted to discuss that with you because...
Well, can we discuss that in a minute?
Okay.
I just want to keep on the sex thing for a second. So Sean dies at the end of the film, and it's terribly tragic, and you know, Nathan runs through the house, he's dead, and everyone's kind of distraught and sorting out, but then they're not kind of, like, people knew it was coming, so it's kind of a muted sort of sadness. And Nathan says to another character, basically, will you spend the night with me tonight?
Yes.
And he says, and we'll fucking everything. And he goes, yes. And so, and that was, to me, I didn't know how to take that personally.
All right. I love that.
Go on.
Yes.
Explain.
Yes, no. So let me.
That just seems to me, I think that's something that was so forthright. Like, I suppose sex is kind of seen, I suppose to me at least, as like something shared with someone else in particular, and like if you've just lost your boyfriend, that you would go straight into bed with another friend.
Well, I think that's a fundamental difference between well, you know, you can't be too categorical because it doesn't apply to everyone, but generally speaking, you know, between gay people and straight people, right? Because, you know, I think for gay people, or for myself certainly, and for these characters in the film, sex is many things. You know, it could be like, you know, the shared emotional experience like we see Sean and Nathan earlier on, you know, or it could just be fun, or it could be sport, or, yeah, kind of like, it's not a big deal, right? Like, you know, it just isn't, right? I mean, I remember having this conversation with my brother where he wanted to show off with how many women he'd slept with, and you had to end the conversation because, you know, it was, you know, it would prove too embarrassing for him, really. Like, you know, and one of the great things about being gay is, you know, how, well, initially, like, I suppose sex is very terrifying, it's certainly taboo and whatever, you know, but it's not an overstressed thing. Like, sex can be many things, right? And in that case, it seemed to me, you know, that it was beautifully done because he said, sure, right? Like, you know, kind of, it's not a big deal. It's, you know, kind of, he needed somebody to hug him, right? And then what happens, like, at the end of it, in fact, he bursts into tears after they have sex, right? Because he's thinking of the person he's lost. And the guy comforts him. Yeah. Embraces him, right? So, you know, kind of this territorial thing that some, you know, heterosexual men have about sex, that, you know, it's just me and mine, and, you know, and it has to be this, and, you know, whatever, which is always a hypocritical, because often the people who most state that is the people who do other things. You know, I've never thought it was like a tension with gay men that, like, I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, a lot of gay men have problems with sex, and there are different kinds of ways that gay men have sex, and sex means different things to different gay men, you know. But for many of us, it's just not a big deal. Yeah. It's like eating, right? Like, it's easy to get, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember listening to Dan Savage talk about this, who's a he's a gay man. He's an agony aunt, sort of a writer on sex and romance, and a podcaster as well. And I remember him talking about how when a man and a woman agree to have sex, that's just it. They agree to have sex. And with gay men, when you agree to have sex, that's just the beginning of the conversation. Because the conversation is then about, okay, how and who's on top and who does this and who does that and what are we going to do. And so there's a kind of freedom with discussing sex and it being a part of a normal conversation.
Remember
that isn't the
first
case.
Scene. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go on.
But remember the first scene in this film, the first sex scene, which takes place in his bedroom.
Yeah.
And how does it start? And there's this whole negotiation, will you use a condom, will you not use a condom, I don't like condoms, blah, blah, right? Like, so actually, they're in bed already, and they're talking about all other kinds of things.
Yeah.
And some of it is sexual, but then, they go on to talk about the mother, kind of, it is a conversation, right? So, I mean, not always, but in the film, they actually show how it is also that kind of
Yes.
thing. Yeah. It is an example of that as well.
Yeah.
So
I suppose it was just, and that all made sense to me, and I found that actually quite beautiful. But it was just that particular moment towards the end of the film where it was like the guy's just lost his boyfriend, and right away, kind of sex is still on the table with someone else.
Yes.
Was that seemed? I don't think it's any problem with the film. I think it was something that the film was kind of showing to me that was just something I didn't know.
Yes.
You know what I
mean?
mean?
I think it's even more beautiful because to me it seems even more honest, right? Like it's not that big a deal. If you want sex, I'll give you sex, right? Kind of, just come and cuddle me, right? And actually, that's what happened, right? So and I thought what was beautiful about that moment was actually the moment where his face contorts and he just starts sobbing, right? And the guy's there to cuddle him. Yeah. That's the, you see, the sex is just like a byproduct, like a little sideline issue, in which he's lonely and he needs company and he's got no one else and he needs someone to cuddle. And this guy, in the film, because the film builds up these very complex relationships just along glances, So this guy, who is the guy who runs meetings in ACT UP, has been after him for a long time. Sean, the lover who dies, knows he's been after him for a long time, which is why he kicks him out of his, hospital room. Right, I don't want to see you. Right, you remember that?
Yes, I do.
So kind of, so there are all of these. Sex, desire, the potential for sex, and so on, is always on the table in some way, right? But it's also, so I suppose it's not contradictory. It's always on the table, and maybe because it's always on the table, it's always unimportant, right? Or it's usually unimportant, let's say.
Yeah, or it takes on different meanings.
Yes, different meanings.
Yeah.
And it takes different meanings with different people.
Yes.
So sex with some people is an act of love and, communicating feeling and whatever. And, sometimes, it's like, it is, I think like the food is the best analogy, because sometimes you pour your heart out for someone in a meal and you're communicating all these things with what you've cooked and how you cooked and how much time you spent for it and, whether it's their favorite dish or whatever, and sometimes it's just like beans on toast because you need fuel, right? And sometimes you want to impress a guest and some, like, it can be all kinds of things, food, can't it?
Yeah.
Right, and I think kind of, sex, for me, and for a lot of other gay men, and certainly is the way that it's depicted in this film, can be many, many things. And people are not reducible to a sex act.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I think, the other, an important point that the film also makes.
And I think it's really, I don't think I've seen sex portrayed that way before, or if I can't think of it, and I certainly haven't seen it portrayed anything close like that in heterosexual relationships.
Yes.
I mean, in heterosexual relationships, basically sex is the goal, at least for a bloke, at least for a straight guy, it is.
Yes.
I mean, you get all those films, like those teen movies about, we're going to all lose our virginity by the end of the summer and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Like, doesn't really matter what we do. As long as it's sex, doesn't really matter anything else. Yeah, and that couldn't be more unlike this film.
Yes. So what did you think of the mother? Right, so Sean dies, and let's go back to the death actually, because I think it's clearly euthanasia. Though the film is.
I felt the film was pretty clear about it.
Okay.
I did go back and watch that a couple of times because I wanted to be sure.
Okay.
And it's done with very few words, but but they, I think Sean says, "Is everything ready?"
Yes.
And he says, "Careful, you don't want to prick yourself."
Yes.
And then you see him in the middle of the night. He gets up. Nathan can't sleep, I think.
Yeah.
So gets up in the middle of the night and injects Sean with, I guess it's morphine, though it's not stated.
Yes.
An overdose, and then goes back to sleep on the floor next to him.
Yes.
And wakes up a few hours later and he's died. So the film seemed to me pretty clear.
I thought the way the film handled that was very interesting because I think it is clear. It was clear to me, but it is open to other interpretations in the sense that, injecting the patient with medicine is something, at set intervals.
Sure.
It's part of a treatment. You remember when they go on holiday and he's kind of counting all those plasma cases, right? They need one for each day. Yeah, those bags of fluid. And so, and that has to be injected. Yeah, so I think...
Yeah.
And also, the shock and the tears and the surprise when he actually finds him dead, which feels very real, So, but I think it is also... Anyway, so those are things that kind of could lend itself to a slightly different reading, though for me it was also very clear, that it was euthanasia as an act of love, right? And also because there's a phrase that's really stayed with me in the film, where, Sean says, j'ai pas souffert encore, mais je sais que ça va venir, which kind of, it sounds more beautiful in French, but it translates as, I really haven't suffered yet, or I haven't suffered yet, but I know that it will come.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the moment where it's just become unbearable, right? So he wants to sit in the sofa, but he's not comfortable there, and actually he's just not comfortable anywhere. Right. So kind of the moment has come where he's really suffering now. So I thought that was kind of quite amazing.
Yeah.
But what did you think of the mother?
I don't remember her too well, but the impression I got of her was that... Didn't she seem sort of surprisingly supportive or embedded within... or sort of how else to phrase it? Sort of unintimidated by Sean's friends in the way that you might expect older people to be?
I would say not only unintimidated, but almost kind of delighted by them. Right, and actually, to me, that was also a kind of a very touching moment because, often parents of gay children, the only thing they know, especially if they're not supportive, if they're not out, they know very little about their children. Really, as simple as that, right? Because kind of most of your life you can't share with them. So there was a moment where I think you got the feeling that she was surprised and happy that. That Sean had so many friends and that so many people came over and that kind of, so many people were helping. And she was like very matter of fact.
Yes.
Right. And asking for help, right, and so on. And then also kind of, at the end, nonetheless quite forceful about, how he should be remembered, right? So they try to write a little obituary. I don't know if you remember.
Yes.
Right, and she insists on
courage.
putting in,
She wants to put the word courage in.
Courage, yes. So I thought that was just lovely.
Yeah.
And really touching.
And then his death, they talk about how he wanted his death to be a political act.
Yes.
And so they take his ashes. Well, that's right, they're talking about discussing using his ashes as a political sort of tool, rather like...
They throw it at a party conference or something. There's a banquet
that's right.
with politicians and they throw ashes all over the food.
It's in that discussion in the kitchen they're talking about, we'll keep 50%, and then they're like, well, maybe more like 80-20.
Yes. Yes. So the mother makes a negotiation.
Yeah.
What do you think of the music? Because the title is partly, like 120 beats per minute is the beat of your heart, but it's also the beat of that kind of house
No,
music.
it's not.
Isn't
120. Well, it is if you're running, I suppose. But resting BPM is more like 80.
Okay. Well,
maybe you need to see the doctor.
I think the title maybe comes from
trance music of the time.
The trance music of the time, but also a relationship maybe to your heart dancing or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think an elevated heartbeat.
Yes.
I think it speaks to that as well. I mean, the film, with regards to the music, the film does sort of sink into these sort of melted, flowing raves that you should see. Like, they're not like train spotting raves, or rather they're not filmed like train spotting raves, where it's like drug fueled and mad and aggressive. They are these kind of trance is the word, right? They're places where you can kind of sink into yourself and be free.
Yes.
Amongst people like yourself.
Well, I think also dancing was. I always associate kind of those years with death and dancing,
Right.
because also one of the first things that people with HIV, especially if they're young, really kind of what they want to do is live, right? And to have use of your body and things like that, right? So actually dancing and nightclubbing and so on becomes very important because, it's like you're alive, right? So kind of, and I think the film combines that so beautifully. Like every action that they do, somehow it always ends up in a nightclub, or you see kind of moments, of music and dancing, and that's interspersed with imagery of a virus of some kind, right?
Yes. Yeah. Doesn't the film end on dancing as well?
It does. It's very. I think it's very beautiful. So again, I think they're all. So is it after the funeral? Anyway, they're all at. It's after the action that follows the funeral. They go back to the disco. And there's this beat, and you hear Jimmy Somerville singing "Small Town Boy," and then the song is over, and then all that remains is the beat, and even all the instruments kind of get withdrawn, and you just have the beat, and then you have the shuffling of feet. I think, and then it goes to dark, right? So you do get this sense of like, dancing, kind of, And dancing on death, really,
Yeah.
I thought it was very beautiful.
It is. Very melancholy.
Yeah, it's very sad. But also very affirming, right? And again, just to relate it back to The Inheritance, it is about one generation of gay men letting another, which is, whichever young people go to the movies now, kind of, or putting them in dialogue, with something from another period that has actually shaped what is possible for them, and that extolled a really heavy price. Kind of AIDS was our Holocaust, in the sense that nobody helped. Not only did nobody help, but actually people actively obstructed.
Yeah, well, not only that, but you were victimized for being the victims yourself.
Exactly, So I think kind of the film is really kind of like this intergenerational kind of, dialogue, really. That kind of, and not just intergenerational in the sense of like gay men speaking to gay men, because it must be said, the film was a popular success in France, right? I think it had 800,000 entries. It sold 800,000 tickets in Paris, right? Yeah. So it's been a big mainstream hit in Paris. It isn't, so obviously it is very much a gay film, but it's actually a gay film that has spoken to the nation as a whole somehow, right, in Paris.
Well, so you educated me as well. And like I said, even if I felt like I didn't have a sense of identification, I felt that sense of era and place and the movement very, very strongly. Yes. I came out of the film richer than I went in.
Yes. It has very poetic moments as well, I think, the turning the Seine red.
Yes.
That was kind of like,
in fantastic. The dream, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's wrap up and get kind of last words on the film.
It won the Grand Prix, didn't it? At Cannes.
Okay, I did.
Yes.
I hadn't registered.
The second most prestigious honour at Cannes behind
yes.
Palme d'Or. It won that, and it's won 6 César Awards.
Yes.
Including Best Film.
Which are like the French Academy Awards. Yeah.
So it's been very, very well received as well.
Yes.
And unsurprisingly so.
Yes.
It's a fucking work of art.
Good. I'm glad you said so, because one of the things that's been a beef of mine is how films like this, which are great, and they're very accessible and so on, how we are now so deprived of them. I think, the film ran at the Mac for a little while. It had a week, the Electric, a week of screenings of the Electric. But it's dispersed amongst other things. It probably only screened once a day or whatever.
Yeah.
For 5 days. So, like all told, there might have been like 8 or 9 screenings in Birmingham of this, this great film that won, the Grand Prix at Cannes, and that won, like basically the French Academy Award for Best Film of the Year, and those were our only opportunities to see it on a big screen. I think it's kind of pathetic, really.
Yeah, pathetic's the word.
So anyway, do see it if you can. I think it is playing on Curzon Home Cinema, which is not ideal, but it's better than not seeing it at all. I think it's a truly, truly great film.
Yeah, I wish I'd caught it at the Mac, but I basically didn't leave in time.
Yes.
It's my own fault. And but I'm glad I've seen it. I'm glad you forced me round to, because you've got to see this bloody thing. Yes, all right,
it's
I will.
important to me.
Yeah, and like I say, I can totally see why. And I think it's a film that sort of it feels like it does its the people on which it's based. It does them justice.
Yes, which is important, because so many of those people who did so much died so young, and are really largely forgotten, except by those of us who were intimate with them. So kind of I'm glad that the battles that they fought, which have been to the benefit of all, are being recognized in as great a film as this.
Yeah, it does have that feeling of, as you were saying, kind of educating people who've benefited from those fights, who don't know about it.
Yes.
And don't appreciate it, and maybe even take it for granted to an extent.
Yes.
It has the benefit of very sort of viscerally educating you on what they did and what not exactly what they did, but what life was like back then and why it was so important, and how, and in comparison to your life now, the way you would have been living sort of 20-25 years ago.
I had a very interesting discussion with a friend where he was saying, oh, well, it must have been different in Canada where, I lived this period. Because here, I lived in London, it didn't affect me at all. I didn't know anybody, who was infected or whatever. And I thought, I kind of, I don't doubt that he was telling his truth, but also I think he misapprehended it in the sense that, very simple things, like the very act of reaching for a condom, it's something that you didn't have to do, like, before the AIDS crisis, right? Like, you just didn't, there's no need to, you didn't, right? So actually, kind of how you had sex, who you had sex with, when, the value of relationships, kind of things like, there was, in Montreal, there were soup kitchens because, people with AIDS were evicted and had nowhere to go. And so there was a whole level of just organizational structures around, on a community level, that developed out of a necessity like that, right? And of course, people chose to be involved or not to be involved. Like kind of, in different ways. But, in my view, it was all around, right? And the same energies that went around, organizing soup kitchens and shelter is also the same kind of energy that went into organizing film festivals, and kind of community centers and political lobbying that then resulted in things like equal rights and gay marriage and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, kind of, the debt to those people, those who died and those who helped out is kind of immeasurable. So. Voila. We better end here. So, well, thank you very much for seeing that.
Yeah, well, thank you for making it.
And I'm sorry I bullied you into it.
No.
And thank you all very much for listening. And if you do get a chance to see it, please do. We are on Twitter, SoundCloud, Facebook,
iTunes. We're eavesdropping@themovies.com, I guess, is a sort of central page, and then everything else is on the internet somewhere.
Yes, and be aware that we now have a back catalogue. So, if you've come late to Eavesdropping at the Movies, but you're seeing a film either, by renting it on DVD or, you've seen it on television and you want to figure out, what did Mike and Jose think about this film? You can kind of easily look it up. So please do.
Yeah, unless the film came out at the cinema before August last year.
So it's exactly what's on Netflix now, or available for rental.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.